Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Canned Air, your tribute to pop culture. I am Jeremy Colley.
And I'm Jack Doherty.
And our guest today is here to talk about his new book, Mapping the Night, which is his latest book based off an actual crime and circumstances. We welcome award-winning author David Bethel to the show. David, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me and for letting me join you in conversation with your audience.
Very excited to have you, but I have to ask you a question before we get started. When the cameras turned on and you saw the two of us sitting with all this shit behind us, was there a moment where you were like, "Oh God, what did Lori get me into?"
Not really. I've talked to a few other folks who had all that shit behind them too, so I'm good.
Fair enough, man.
All right.
I'll take it. Well, I think we're doing a new thing on the show where we're not going to bury you guys in our socials and then all that stuff until the end of the episode. So we're just going to jump right into it. Once again, David, thank you for being here. And, with all of our guests, I like to kind of jump back and get an idea of where you guys came from. And one of the earliest things I could find with you is that you lived all over the world with your father, who was a U.S. State Department Foreign Service officer. And I was curious if you could, one, talk about, your time traveling, being around the world with him, and two, exactly what his job entailed.
Sure, be happy to. Yes, I was the son of a foreign service officer, which meant I spent the first 14 years of my life traveling from various cities and countries in Europe to Japan, various cities in Japan, down to the Caribbean, to Havana, Cuba. In the meantime, we sometimes came back to the States to visit, but I never spent any amount of time in the United States until I was 14. As I said, I think I totaled up some time before I entered high school in Miami, where I finished high school. I attended 10 schools, so you can imagine it was a lot of traveling, and it was enjoyable. Maybe more so in hindsight as I got older. Perhaps I appreciated it more at the time. When you're moving every 18 months or 2 years and don't have an opportunity to make friends, it can be a little trying for a child. I don't know that I ever dwelled on it so much because most of my friends were in the same boat I was in, and the other friends, they were either in the Foreign Service, my friends, or I had friends whose parents were in the armed service, so they also traveled a lot. So in hindsight, yes, it was very. It gave me a much broader perspective on life than maybe I would have had otherwise.
So you guys were living like on military bases or embassies? Where were you guys living exactly?
It depended. In some countries, we lived on our own. I mean, you just my parents rented a house, for instance, in Tokyo and Nagoya and Yokohama, the three places we lived in. In Japan, only Tokyo did we live on a compound, and it wasn't a military compound. It was a foreign service compound. In Havana, we lived in a house in a regular neighborhood. The same in Germany. We lived in houses and neighborhoods. We didn't live in compounds.
Wow. How neat. All those different cultures.
Yes, it was.
Learn a lot of different languages too.
I wish I had.
Really?
Actually, my mother told me I spoke pretty good German. The only experience I have where I remember that I could speak German was we came back once from Germany after being gone for a few years. My mother was a native of Brooklyn, New York. She was born and grew up there, and she was Jewish, and she lived in a Jewish neighborhood. And we went into a butcher shop, and I was listening to them talk in Yiddish. I guess I must have thought it was German because I started to talk to the butcher in German. And his background, later I learned, having been a Holocaust survivor, he was not thrilled to death with the idea that I was trying to speak to him in German. So that's the only remembrance I have that I spoke German. I couldn't tell you Gesundheit, Volkswagen. That's about it in German. But I did pick up Spanish. I speak fairly good Spanish. I wouldn't say I'm bilingual, but I can get myself in trouble in Spanish. And then Japanese, no, not a word. Ikura desu ka? I remember that one because that means how much is it? So how much does it cost? So that's about it for Japanese.
Wow. Another thing I had read, you mentioned Cuba during your travels when you were really young. Got to meet the newly elected prime minister of Cuba, Fidel Castro. That's crazy. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, except he wasn't elected, unless you consider being elected by the point of a gun. But yeah, it was an interesting time. As I mentioned, my father was in the Foreign Service. He was a press attaché, which means he was the liaison with all of the dignitaries or actors, whatever, who came from the United States to whatever country we were in, and he helped them with their press relations. That being the case, in Havana, he put together the first international press conference for Castro about a week after he came into power, and it was at a hotel in Havana, one of these big fancy hotels that no longer exist. And he took me down to a room where Castro was staying prior to the press conference. My dad made all the arrangements, told the press what to expect and what to do and all that kind of stuff. He took me down to the room and he was going to brief Castro with the same information. So we walked into this room, and you have to put yourself in the place of most of us living in Cuba at the time. We knew there was a civil war going on. We knew that Castro was in the hills fighting Batista, who was the dictator at the time. So everybody knew who the players were. Nobody expected it to end quite the way it did. But anyway, so we walk into this room, and there's Castro sitting on a sofa with Che Guevara on one side and his brother Raul on the other, and a bunch of what they called back then barbudos, meaning bearded ones. These were his troops in the hills, and they were all standing around behind him. This was his security force. So for a kid, 11 years old, I think I was, this was like, unbelievable being in a room with these people. And then Castro gets up and approaches my father, because my father has to brief him on what to expect, what is going to be expected of him. So, every little boy compares his father with whoever's in the room. My dad happened to be a very big guy, 6'3", about 230 pounds, and Castro was also very big. So I was impressed with that to begin with. Oh my God, I didn't usually see people as big as my father. So the fact that Castro was, I remember that being an impression that I had at first. So they're talking back and forth about what to expect when he goes upstairs. Of course, I wasn't interested. I could care less. But he had a sidearm. I guess I came up to about about here on him, the chest level. And so I'm almost staring at his sidearm, and I'm just fascinated by this gun. I never touched a gun before. So Castro notices my attention, and he says to my father, he says, "Excuse me, notice your son is very interested in this sidearm." He says, "I have a son about his age. I haven't seen him in a while, so it's nice to have a youngster around. Would you mind if I if I disarmed the gun, took the clip out, made sure there was no bullet in the chamber, could I give it to him?" So yeah, my dad says, "Fine." So he gives me this gun. Of course, I am just in heaven with Castro in the room, and I have a gun in my hand. So after they go through the particulars of what's going to go on upstairs, he takes us upstairs. My father does with Castro in the elevator. As we're going up in the elevator, Castro says to me, "I tend to talk a lot, and your dad explained to me he's going to have me on a couch with a coffee table in front and a pitcher of water and a glass. So whenever I point at you, you give me water. You pour a glass pour me a glass of water." So I'm thrilled to death. I'm actually part of all that's going on. And during the press conference, I'm not paying any attention to what's going on. Again, I'm 11. I really don't care. But at some point, I notice that there's an altercation going on between Castro and an American newspaper reporter who's continually badgering him, wanting to know whether he is going to allow gambling in Cuba after he puts together his administration. Castro, for whatever reason, does not want to answer that question. But the American, being an American reporter, does what American reporters do and continues to badger him. Castro, and I noticed that at some point, that there was a problem. I looked up, and this gentleman, nice guy, Castro, suddenly changed completely. I mean, it's like he went into a dark place. They talk about shark eyes and these weird people that, changing personalities. That's what he did. And at 11, and he tells the reporter, he says, "If you continue asking me this question, I'm going to have my men behind me, these Barbuda, just drag you out of this room. So I am not going to answer your question." So when people ask me, how did my life prior to coming to the United States and becoming a writer, how did it affect me? Whenever I want to write how these characters in my novels, because I write a lot about the deviant personalities, change completely over, just from one second to the next. I remember that incident, and I use that as kind of a, kind of my guidepost for writing about some of these people, because
Wow.
clearly Castro had a very, very dark side to his personality.
That's
Yeah.
insane. No one has that story out there. That is
No.
insane. I mean, you had to have been petrified. Like when you're sitting there next to him and you see that change wash over, or were you still feeling like a sense of like, I'm secure here, this guy's just crazy, or like were you petrified?
Well, the fact that I still remember this so clearly, and this was, so many years ago, clearly it had an effect on me. I wouldn't say I was petrified. I was flummoxed. I'd never seen anything like this. Was this normal? I mean, does this happen to other people? It was more of that kind of reaction. I remember afterward asking my dad, and he said at the time, he said, we're going to have problems with this guy. And those were his words to me.
Wow,
We, being the Americans, we're going to have problems with this guy.
that is insane. What a story, man. What a
Well,
story.
well,
Yes.
Cuba was good for these kind of stories because I met Ernest Hemingway and Errol Flynn. Uh,
What?
yeah, yeah. And in other circumstances, my parents used to go to a small bar in Old Havana called Bodeguita del Medio, and it was a hangout for people like Hemingway and Errol Flynn and tourists. And he knew them because he used to drink with them in this bar. So we went there for my 12th birthday. Never forget it. Sitting there with my family, and over walks Ernest Hemingway. And of course, I knew who he was. I didn't. I didn't have the understanding that I do now of who Ernest Hemingway was, but I did know who he was. So I was impressed, that this guy came over and wished me a happy birthday. And not 10 minutes later, Errol Flynn walks over, says the same thing, happy birthday. And it's interesting, there's kind of a sidelight to the story. As he's walking away, this was, Earl Flynn 20 years after Robin Hood. And my sister says to my father, boy, Robin Hood sure got fat.
I hope he was out of earshot.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, he was. He was definitely out of earshot.
That's incredible.
Yeah, well, there's another great story about Earl Flynn, too, as long as we're talking about him.
Sure.
Um, One night about 3 in the morning, we get a call at the house, and I heard the phone ring, which is unusual at 3 in the morning, and I didn't know what
Right.
was going on. I heard my parents kind of muffled talking back and forth. Next morning at breakfast, my dad shows up in the middle of our breakfast, and he's telling the story to my mother. Errol Flynn called him about 3 in the morning. What happened was, is he being Errol Flynn, he was having a to do with some women in his room in a hotel, and I guess someone in another room on the hallway called the cops, and they came, and he realized what was happening when he asked who was at the door. They said La Policia. So he ran out. He grabbed all of his drugs. He was a noted druggee, and he threw them off the balcony. So after this is all over, he calls my father, come, I have to talk to you about this. My dad doesn't really know what's going on, but he knows there's a problem. So he figures he's going to have to clean it up some. As he's walking in the hotel to go up to Errol Flynn's room, he sees Errol Flynn in a robe, all he has on is a white robe, and he's rooting around in the grass. And my dad says, Errol, what the hell are you doing? He says, and he explains to my father, well, when they came to the door, I had to throw all my drugs off the balcony. So you got to come back out here and help me find these drugs.
Wow. Wonder if he ever found him.
Well, I don't know. Well, I didn't get that far in the story.
Yeah, I'm sure. Wow, incredible. So, very much like your father, you had a career in government and politics as well. You were press secretary and speechwriter for members of Congress, senior advisor, and speechwriter for the Secretaries of Commerce and Education, which is a mouthful. So, can you explain exactly what your job was? I mean, speechwriter, I get that, but I'm sure it's more detailed. It's more complicated than those two words.
Well, it is to an extent. you're a communication strategist, basically. I mean, there's more to speech writing than just sitting down and putting words
Right.
on a page. You have to know who you're, who you're writing for, why you're writing, what issues you want to emphasize. Sometimes minds you want to change, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's a little bit more than that. But I think there's been maybe a misunderstanding too about the job of a speechwriter, thinking that they sit down, they write a speech, they give it to whoever they wrote it for, and that guy or woman goes out and merely parrots the speech. These people that you write, well, at least when I was in Washington, I don't know what the hell's going on in Washington these days. I mean, it's so far beyond me. But anyway, most of these people would sit down with you and work on an editing of the speech. I mean, these are intelligent people. Again, they used to be. I don't know what's going on today. And they had a strong point of view on various issues, and they wanted to make sure that whatever you were writing reflected exactly what they wanted to say. An interesting story here. Paul Laxalt, Senator Paul Laxalt, who I wrote for, was scheduled to give the nominating speech for Ronald Reagan when he was being nominated to run for president. Paul was very close to the governor of California at the time, who was Ronald Reagan. They were governors at the same time, and they just became personal friends. So when Reagan decided to run for the presidency, he tapped Paul to be his campaign manager. So all of us who were working for Laxalt at the time became involved in that. So anyway, we're putting together the speech so that he can nominate Reagan. The point being, I wrote the speech. Working with him, I wrote the speech, but Laxalt would never read anything that you wrote for him. What he would do is read the speech over 4 or 5 times, make notes on a note card of the things that stuck, to him, made the most difference to him. And then we would use the speech as the handout to the press. So we stood by the words in the speech, but he really only used it as a jumping off point for what he wanted to say. And I think most politicians, I don't know about today, most politicians back then, that's the way they worked. Very few of them read from a teleprompter. I think that's something that's probably gained more notoriety recently than back then. I don't remember Paul Laxalt ever reading anything from a teleprompter.
Wow. What an amazing career, man. How much fun, and I would imagine also very, very stressful. Or would I be wrong? I mean, you're a writer. You maybe, I don't know, maybe it was easy for you.
The writing part was easy. I mean, that wasn't, as I was explaining, that's not really the tough part. The tough
Right.
part is, understanding the issues and being able to relay those issues in a way that relate to people, the way people can understand. Because a lot of these issues, the policy issues, are a little more arcane
Right.
than you're often, led to believe by listening to someone talk about them. So the writing was never an issue. You have to be able to get the voice, of the person you're writing for, to understand their cadence, their rhythms, what words they use, how they want to explain themselves, and all that. So, that can be a little bit of a challenge, but the actual sitting down and writing, that was never a problem for me.
And still isn't, based on all the books you have available out there. I'm very curious. At what point did you become interested in writing fiction? Was this something you'd always wanted to do, like during your career, or is it something that you found in retirement?
Um, I would say I've always wanted to write fiction, not so that it took over my life or it was all I could think about, but any writer, I suppose, maybe I shouldn't be speaking for all writers, but I would assume anybody who enjoys writing, that's their goal, to write a book. Most people want to write, most people doing what I do, I think, in politics, want to write a political thriller, for instance. Now, there are a lot of people writing about issues, of course, and things like that. My desire is always to write fiction, to write about these issues, but write them in a way that only you could really delve into the background, the personalities, the emotions, and so on and so forth. As a work of fiction, you can't often get there that easily when you're writing a book, a book on policy or a book on politics.
Now, one thing I had read online that you wrote was that your childhood, which we've already touched on here, your childhood was a fertile training ground for a fiction writer, and that getting close to political and business leaders and seeing the power dynamics proved great inspiration. And you already kind of gave the example of Fidel Castro, but could you elaborate a little more on the inspiration you received from childhood and your career when it comes to writing?
Well, sure. As I said, growing up overseas and being the minority, if you will, in a
Right.
lot of these countries, I didn't grow up the way most Americans grow up. Most Americans grow up. They have a neighborhood. They have their friends for life. They go to the same schools. They play in the same little leagues, and so on and so forth. I didn't have any of that. So my perspective was a lot broader than that, worldly, perhaps. That sounds a little presumptuous. I don't mean it that way. I just mean that instead of going to Little League on Saturdays, I was going to the Japanese temples, things like that. Or uh, I was I was going into the caves around with my friends that were dug in all around Tokyo for the people that were still there, that the people had to go into when the Americans were bombing Tokyo. So we went into these labyrinth of caves, and it was just, I mean, a wonderful adventure, something again that I just took for granted. I didn't know that this was not what the Americans were doing at home. I really didn't know what the hell was going on with people at home. And we would find things like old lanterns, parts of guns, helmets, and things like that. And then there were these
Wow.
big subterranean, not really caves, but airports underground that they had to keep the Japanese bombers and fighters safe. And we would go into those things that were massive, just massive things that we used to go into and play around in. And so that that has to have an effect. That is
Yeah.
a charge to your imagination. I mean, that
Mhm.
your imagination is electrified by these kinds of things. And then, as far as politics goes, well, you're dealing with all of these different personalities. You're dealing with, people who others consider famous, but who you work with every day, and they are just people. Ted Kennedy, Barry Goldwater, people like this who you come into contact with. You come into contact with them, with the people on their staff. Again, it is fertilizer for your imagination. If you can't use any of what I just mentioned to you as fertilizer for writing a book, then you have no imagination.
Sure.
Mhm.
Damn. It's incredible. You talk about that underground air hangar and how
Yeah.
massive it is, which is almost, I think in my case, it might scare the hell out of me a little bit. I think about a time years ago when I was a child, we went to the Air and Space Museum over at Wright Pat here, and just on the inside of one of their hangars, they had this huge deflated blimp lining the ceiling. And the whole museum was under it. No matter where you were standing in this huge building, you look up and see this thing. And to this day, I think I've told you this before, Jack. To this day, that sticks in my mind. Like I think about it at least twice a year. You know what I mean? How
Yeah.
something like that can leave an impression.
Imagine looking at it when
Well,
you're a little kid too, though. So it's going to be
Yeah,
like 10
10
times the
times bigger.
size. And then your
well,
imagination just takes it and throws it everywhere.
imagine an airport underground. That's
Ah,
basically where, I mean, they had runways, where they had to run these planes down the runway and up and out of whatever was built underground. So yeah, it was huge. Again, I think because I was with a bunch of friends and because I didn't know any better,
mhm.
that it was just an adventure, just a normal adventure that, well, normal. I mean, I knew it wasn't normal, but it was an adventure that I was having that was not something that scared me so much as it just propelled me to want to know more about what happened. And I
Right.
eventually found out. I asked my father what this was, and he explained it to me. And then I did some reading on it and found out more about it.
Incredible. I didn't even know about these tunnels. I mean, I knew there were places like that, but I didn't know they had underground airports. That's insane.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this new book, Mapping the Night, which again is a fictional story, but based around actual crime and circumstance. Can you elaborate more on this?
Sure. About a year ago, maybe, I read an article in the New York Times where police were on a welfare check in a large apartment in New York, and they had been called for this welfare check by the people in the building who had not seen a woman and her son. She was a single mother for a number of days, and they were concerned because they always just, they saw him around the building all the time. So they called. The police came in. Unfortunately, when they went in, they found the body of this woman lying on her bed with her little boy stroking her head with ice because he was trying to revive her, and he didn't know any other way to do that with with ice, because his mother had done that for him when he was sick. So he figured, okay, well, this is what you do. And of course, by the time they came in, he was really upset because he turned around. He said, "You got to help me. This isn't working, and this is the only thing I know to bring her around." Of course, that scene, reading about that, was haunting. It just haunted me. It stuck in my head. And then I read a little more on the case and found out that, first of all, this woman was a victim of a serial killer. He went on to kill others, and he had other victims in his past. In fact, he had just been out of jail for a couple of years because he was in jail for killing before that. So two of the things that stuck in my mind, aside from this haunting, scene of the little boy, all of the scenes where this killer had been were immaculately cleaned up. I mean, not just like someone who went in to get rid of their fingerprints and any evidence that they had been there, but the place was spick and span. All of the places. It turned out later that he had done that, and that he only his victims were women with boys, single mothers with little boys. So those three elements I put together, and I turned it into Mapping the Night. Now, I have to back up a step to explain that I don't write with an outline, and I don't do, character backgrounders and all that kind of stuff. A lot of writers do, and it works for them. It's never worked for me. I've tried it. It just kind of stunted my imagination. So I write by the seat of my pants. I just sat down, wrote down that scene of the woman with her child and some of the background that I just explained on the houses, on the locations being cleaned up and so forth. And I went from there, and I didn't know what I was going to do next, where it was going to go. I knew it was a story that was going to take me somewhere. I just didn't know where. And I didn't know where until I got into the story itself. And that's the way I write most of my books. I take a scene or an incident from a true crime, and I build around it until I have a book.
Okay. Well, that kind of answers, I guess, my next question I had for you. Because this isn't the first time you've used real life crime to inspire, your next book. And I was curious. What I was going to ask was, when you do that, if there's any precautions you have to take. I know in Mapping the Night you mentioned, you're writing about the government trying to keep the identity of a victim under wraps. When writing about something like that, any certain precautions you have to take so it wouldn't be seen as whistleblowing? But that doesn't seem to be the case. It sounds like you just said, you take one scene and start building your fiction around that one scene.
Right. It's amazing how many people have asked me the question you just did. Do I have to get permission from people? Do I have to be careful what I write? If I do, I haven't been. I haven't been. No one's ever said anything to me that, you shouldn't be writing about that. But then again, it's fiction. And maybe that's why I chose fiction as opposed to writing, true crime novels and that sort of thing. And the other reason is, with true crime novels, it's all about the who, what, how, when, and where. I was always interested in the why. Why do these people do the things they do? It's just so, Ted Bundy, Ed Kemper, all of these very, very sick, deviant people. I'm curious what drives them, how they end up doing the things they do. And that's why I ended up writing crime fiction. I wanted the why, not that my why is the why, but for the reader of the book, it explains why. And for me, it explains why. And that's why I got into doing what I'm doing.
Oh, neat. And I'm sorry to ask a question that gets asked all the time, but it's just one of the first things that came to mind, especially in that case. But it made me think of that this is probably stupid to even say. I don't know if you saw the movie Argylle that came out not long ago. I haven't even seen it, with Bryce Dallas Howard, but she's a fiction writer, and one of her books mimics like the real, it's talking about, what was it? A spy organization's real life activities, and then they come after her, kind of stuff. So I know that's,
I've heard that, yeah. I've heard of
fictional
that.
dramatization, but at the same time, well, very cool, man. And you, so many other books too: Evil Town, Hotel Hell, Unheard of, Holding Back the Dark, Blood Moon. One I really want to read is Wretched, based on what was it, Ken McElroy? That story is something.
Yeah,
That's
Wretched. Yeah, that's based on actually two true stories. Rex McElroy, who was and if you know the background, he was a bully in this small town in Missouri for decades, for scores of years. I mean, he was actually, raping and pillaging and stealing and all that. And he did it for 30 years. And finally, one day, I'm surprised it took as long as it did. The people in town just decided they were going to get rid of him, and he came out of the local watering hole one day. They surrounded his truck, about 30 of them, and two of them had live rounds in their guns. They all had guns. This is what I've been able to find out about it. Two of them had live rounds. They shot him and killed him, and then the 30 people just disappeared into the woodwork. Before the locals even got there, he was dead and they were gone. And all the years they have tried investigations from the local, regional, and even the FBI, and they have never been able to crack that case on who killed him. Now, the other part of that's also part of that story, and again, the why, not why did they do it, but how did it end up? There's got to be I wasn't satisfied with the fact that nobody was held responsible or that came forward. I wanted to know, if I took it the next step, how would that go? And the other part of that is there is a very famous called Jefferson 8, about 8 women in Jefferson Parish in Louisiana who just disappeared. Poof, they're gone off the face of the earth over the period of a couple of years. They first described it to a serial killer. They've never been able to solve that case. They don't know where the women went, how they were killed, or anything else. They just know they're not around anymore. And it's turned out that perhaps the police were involved, because they might have been what do you call it? The turncoats. The police didn't want to know what was going on, and they came to the police and said, "This is what's going on, and this is the person who's responsible." Well, the person who was responsible was paying the police to keep quiet. So there's some thought that maybe the police were responsible for the disappearance of these 8 women. Anyway, I put those two stories together and came up with Wretched.
That is horrifying.
Yeah,
to think about something like that out there happening. But it probably happens way more than any of us would ever realize.
Unfortunately.
Oh yeah, I've done a lot of research, a lot of reading, and everything else. Currently, I'm looking into a story of a guy named Dean Corll in, I think, Houston, Texas. He killed 27 young boys. He kidnapped, sexually molested, and killed them over a period of 3 years. And the police kept saying, "Oh, they're runaways." 27 kids. It finally took one of the kids who was working with him to bring these children to him so that he could molest them. Finally, he turned on that kid, and that kid ended up killing him. And that's the only way they found out that he had killed 27 people. Otherwise, wow, they never would have found anything out.
How old was the kid? Do you know?
The one that killed him was 16, I believe.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. It's an amazing story.
20, you said 27.
actually 28. They just recently discovered a 28th body. But imagine that you're living in a small area where 27 people, young kids, disappear, and the police never think to dig any further than say, "Oh, they're all runaways."
Yeah, you'd be petrified if you had a son at home. My God, you wouldn't let him leave.
I guess there's a mitigating factor. All of these kids came from, I guess you'd say, bad homes. Where the father and mother in many of the homes, not all of them, but many of them were, had their own problems, and that's why In some instances, they were able to get away with it because the parents really didn't care all that much, but not 27. I mean, or 20, excuse me, not 28. At some point, someone has to say, what the hell is going on here?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, they're
That's
missing
a
from
lot.
school. They're gone. They're not at school. You know, they're not around their neighborhood anymore. You know, how does that happen?
That's insane. That is insane. What an interesting job you have. That's I can't imagine. I
Well,
mean,
thank you.
I'm not one who delves. I like to watch crime documentaries occasionally, but delving too far into them sometimes for me, I can get a little antsy, you know, like I guess maybe knowing all this stuff out there like this can be a little unnerving sometimes. What about you, Jack? You into
Start
true
watching
crime?
over your shoulder.
Oh yeah.
It interests me, but I can't. Not like some people how they binge it and stuff. Some of it is
Well,
interesting.
you know, it's interesting too. I love the research, and people say, "What are you, sick?" I mean, how can you love the research? Well, I do it as a kind of a study. It's almost an intellectual or academic study. Now, I do it because I do want to find out. I do want to understand something about the brains of these people, how they work. But I can distance myself from it to some extent by considering it kind of a research tool, you know, in order to write the books.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have read some books. I have read some of studies of, you know, FBI files on these killings that you know I've had to put down, where you have to say I just can't read any more of this. This is just way too much. There's an old saying, what is it here? Be careful when you go chasing monsters, because you're going to have to look into the abyss, and eventually the abyss looks back into you. So you have to
Ooh.
be careful about that. And there's a profiler, an FBI profiler by the name of John Douglas, who said, don't ever think that you're ever going to understand any of this that's going on. None of us understand it. And if you think you understand it, you need psychiatric help.
Damn.
Makes sense
That's
though.
deep.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so you have to maintain a distance. It's very important that you do maintain some distance.
Sure. It makes sense. So with all these books, is there any like playing into the same universe? Are there recurring characters throughout these books that tie the books together? Or are they all their own standalone stories?
Well, they're all standalone stories. There are a couple of books, Wretched, Mapping the Night, and another one that I'm working on that have the FBI, two of the FBI agents, Eileen Prado and Ira Fisher, who pop up in these books simply because, well, first of all, the subject matter plays to their strengths since they are FBI profilers. And second of all, I like the characters. So, you know, I've grown to enjoy them. You know, and again, I sit down and write. I don't know where Eileen and Ira are going to go or how they're going to get there, but I know enough about their personalities at this point to be able to play with them a little bit. So, you know, that's fun. But no, they're all standalone. You don't have to read, you know, one in front of the other or anything like that.
Right, right. Not so much that they were continuations, but kind of like you were saying, somebody who might pop up here or there. You know what I mean? It's awesome though when you.
Cameos.
I'm sorry, Jack. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying the good old cameos here and there.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
When you talk about these characters, when you know you talked about how much you just liked those characters and smiled a bit while you did. When you think about those characters, can you visualize what that character would look like in your head? If that makes
Yes,
sense.
I can too. Yeah, because I have to describe them in the book. You can't have a cipher without describing what they look like. And
Sure, but is it like somebody you could pick out on the street kind of detail in your mind? I guess I'm just trying to see what kind of view of your character you have. Because I know there are people who can create a character, but like I guess when they visualize it, they could only really see the words that describe them. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah, of course it does. Yes, and for me, again, I have to be careful because I'm not sure I write the way other people write, but I have to have a fairly good description or vision in my head of these characters physically in order to be able to play around with them in my books. Because, I mean, you know, their physicality determines in many instances, especially for the bad guys, but even for the good ones, how they're going to react to certain things and how people are going to react to them. This Eileen Prado character, it turns out, it was an undercover agent with the New Orleans police before she went into the FBI, and was almost killed during a case that she was working on. So I have to, and she had to physically, she had to be practically remade completely because how badly she was beat up. So that kind of thing that I work with creates a character in my mind that I can see walking, as you said, walking down the street. I can go out in the morning and say hello to her and have a cup of coffee with her. I know her that well.
That's cool, man. That's a great imagination at work right there. That's awesome. Because I don't know that I could do that. I think my mind would only go so far. I don't think I would be able to pick out that character on the street. But that just only bodes well for your books.
Well, I have to do that with all of the main characters in order to be able to write convincingly about them. And if I'm writing convincingly about them, hopefully it comes across as in the story as a convincing story as well.
What is it then about the murder mystery genre, thriller genre that sparks your creativity? Why not like say a rom-com or a sci-fi? I mean, why what is it about the murder mysteries?
I really don't know exactly, except that it's something that, as I said before, when I was my imagination was always sparked by when I read these stories about these strange people. Why would they do something like that? That is the real reason for writing a thriller. Now, a thriller doesn't have to be a mystery. Mapping the Night is not a mystery. I'd say maybe a third of the way through, maybe even before that, the reader's going to know who it is, who's doing this and why they're doing, not the why, but who's doing it. So it's not really a mystery, but it is a thriller. How are they going to bring him under control? How are they going to find him? And how many other people is he going to hurt? So
Right.
all of those elements, every day you wake up is a new day. Everything, you don't know what's going to happen 10 minutes from now. Well, you do because we're doing this, but you know what I mean? I mean, everything, it's like a baby waking up and discovering his toes and discovering his fingers and everything else.
Right.
For me, that's writing a book. And I find that interesting. I want to discover my fingers and toes every day. And when I'm writing, and that's what gets me going. And the idea that someone may also want to chop off my fingers is the thriller part of it. How does that work into the book? And so it's just the way my mind works.
Right. Right. I love it though. Makes for a good author. So I'm curious, have you ever thought about, just sitting here hearing your story, your childhood, growing up with your father, your amazing career, and then all these books that you've written, you're an award-winning author in retirement. Have you ever thought about writing your own biography?
Um, Perhaps, I don't consider myself all that interesting, strangely enough. And to try and make myself interesting, I would almost feel a little embarrassed to do something like that. But yes, when I talk about it and I tell these stories, yes, they're all very interesting. People do not have many of the interest, the experiences that I've had, and I understand that. But trying to put it down on a piece of paper, writing about myself, I think I might find that a little embarrassing. Not because there's anything embarrassing about me, but just I just don't think that I'm all, it's not something I want to delve into all that deeply.
I understand. I understand. But at the same time, you're the one they happen to. It's your norm. Like you already said, these aren't things that most people have experienced in their life. I mean, Bryce, it's been what, 45 minutes, and twice you've had me on the edge of my seat, man. Like, like I think that would go
Hey,
really well.
Reading that
Well,
Fidel Castro story.
well,
Yeah.
maybe I could write my life as fiction, and maybe I could do that. That way, I put a little distance between myself and what I'm writing about. So, that's a possibility. But to sit here and write, put myself on a piece of paper and dissect myself and what was I thinking and how was I feeling, I don't think I could do that.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, there's so many levels to putting yourself out there. It's not so much the content it's just the idea of telling other people, this is about me. Check it out. That's where my mind goes. When we started doing this years ago, I wanted to do it. I wanted people to hear it, but I didn't want my face or name or anything on it. I kept distance between me and what I was loving to do, if that makes any sense. But
Oh, it does. Absolutely. I just explained why. Yeah, I can understand completely. When did you finally decide yourself, I think I can put a microphone in front of my mouth here and be on television, and be on the screen, and it's not going to bother me?
oh boy, it came with some kicking and screaming. I mean, I was having full-blown panic attacks, but I just got
It
to
was
a
a
point.
while before you finally said something.
Yeah, it got to a point where I realized, like, if this is going to go anywhere, like what our vision was for this, like, it has to happen. It just has to happen. So it's either, quit doing it or put yourself out there and just do it. And I just forced myself into it, just forced myself into a hot bath and just sat there until I acclimated. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, that sounds a lot like how I write a book. I just sit in a hot bath and wait for it to, and wait for it to gel around me until I have a story. I love the title of this, the canned air. The canned air. It's very clever.
Wow, thank you. I think that's a first, Jack.
No one's ever brought that up and said that's a very original name for a podcast.
Jack, do you remember anyone?
The screen froze, so I lost probably the last 30
He was
seconds.
just complimenting the title Canned Air, saying it was very well. I don't want to repeat your words. What'd you say?
No, very original. It's very descriptive of what you're doing. It's just very original. I love the name of the podcast.
Well, thank you. It's actually a tribute to the movie Spaceballs, when they're huffing the air out of the cans. We just love Spaceballs. We love Mel Brooks. So
I love that. Yeah.
So, but thank you. It was very kind of you to say.
Oh, of course.
And I have a link that Lori sent me, an Amazon link that I'm going to put in the description here for people to get Mapping the Night. I believe there's a preview on there for people to read too for free if they wanted to check it out further. And I know you have a website. Is it johndavidbethel.com, or is that changed?
No, that's right. www.johndavidbethel.com. Yeah, you can find me there.
And then Instagram at jd.bethel, and on Twitter at words like. I think that's what that says. Yeah, word likes. Pardon me. All this will be in the description, written out accurately. Don't rely on my tongue to take you there. But is there anywhere else I should be directing people, David?
Goodreads. They can find me on Goodreads as well. John David Bethel, Goodreads. You can find me, find the books there as well.
Okay, I'll attach one of those links too. But David, thank you so much for stopping by. We'll have to do it again in the future. I mean, as often as you're pumping out books, it seems like this could come back around, and we could talk about your next one too.
Oh, anytime. I'll stay in touch. How's that?
Hey, love hearing that. Love staying in touch. Love making new contacts on this show. That's, it's really one of the best things about it, is the network of people we've built over the past decade. And I don't know. It's like our own world, isn't it, Jack?
It's our very own.
It's like writing a book. You're a creator. They say the doctors think of themselves often as gods. I'm creating my own little world, so I'm the god of that world. Someone once asked me if I ever get scared writing these books. I said no, because I'm the one creating it. If I get scared, I just stop, or I erase what's scaring me.
Yeah. I like the way you put that. I'm the god of my own world. I mean, it's how we kind of feel over here sometimes, I guess. I don't know. I just love having our own little club.
We all have to be benevolent, though. We have to be good gods. We have to be very benevolent.
Yes. Well, David, once again, thank you so much for being here again. Let's circle back and do this again in the future. And
Absolutely.
In the meantime, Jack, why don't you tell these lovely people where they can check us out?
If you go to cannedairpodcast.com, you can listen, like, follow, subscribe, become a patron, buy some merch, see some YouTube videos, and if you'd like to be a guest and promote your work, send us an email on our contacts page. We should get graphics.
What?
We should get graphics. So
we do have graphics. Do you not watch the videos after
listen, follow?
You got to start watching the finished videos. There are graphics.
You two have to get together on this.
Yeah, maybe we aren't gods after all. Don't forget to find us on Twitter at CannedAirPod, on Instagram at canned_air, and on TikTok at Canned Air Podcast. And at the website Jack was just talking about, cannedairpodcast.com, the one that's shown right here, Jack, in the graphic. Also has ways you can support us. There's a link to our merch site that has, shirts, hoodies, help me, Jack, cups, stickers.
Mugs, stickers, yep.
All kinds of crap. I mean,
Hats.
Good stuff with our logos on it. And a Patreon page where, we've been building that catalog for going on 5 years. Can you believe that? Going on 5 years. So a lot of listening and watching on there to do. And it's $5 a month, people. Come on. Scratch our back a little bit. What else, Jack? What else we got for him?
Oh, evergreenpodcast.com, that our gracious podcast host.
Our network.
Other podcasts, but listen to us first.
Yeah, there's a lot of them on there, but we're obviously the best one. I mean, that
clearly.
Okay.
We're on it. We're gods of our own worlds, right?
There you go. No doubt. And you're benevolent gods, too.
You will listen to us first.
Couldn't have said it better myself, David. But, all right, I think that's going to do it for this week's episode. So until next time, I am Jeremy Colley.
I'm Jack Doherty.
And I'm John David Bethel.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Be excellent to each other.